Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Giles Mandelbrot. I'm the librarian of Lambeth Palace Library, which is one of the group members of CERL through the very ingeniously constructed London group of libraries who are CERL members. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our session this afternoon. We're starting off with Cristina Dondi, who probably it's true that if anybody could be said to need no introduction in this particular context, Cristina is the person. She's already been referred to as a dynamo. As everyone here will know, she's the secretary of the Consortium of European Research Libraries. She'll be speaking to us this afternoon, I think, principally on the basis of her own research, which she published about a year or so ago on printed books of ours from 15th century Italy. So she's speaking about liturgical data from books of ours.
Thank you, Giles. I have the book here, and I'll circulate it around. So you will see what I talk about certain issues. So, what to look when you have a book of hours in your hand? What is its liturgical use? Information which can be provided in the opening of the book or which can be inferred from internal evidence. An examination of its liturgical parts. A book of hours is a liturgical book. There is some disquisition on the subject, but there are undeniably liturgical elements in it, and they can be used for identification. The Office of the Dead, the Office of the Virgin, the Office of the Holy Week leading to Easter. This is a less frequently present in Book of Hours, and I believe its insertion is the result of cross-contamination with confraternity books, libri da compagnia. Then, of course, we can look at their calendars and litanies, iconography, and illustration. And I will go through these. This is very technical, detailed information, but one which, taken systematically, has allowed me to draw very wide-ranging conclusions on the dissemination of a genre which has a very long history. Books of hours were bestsellers, but also long sellers, were used by the social elites of the 14th century, while 4 centuries later, they became libri comunissimi, so popular and frequently printed that no privilege was allowed by the city of Venice, and the work of Laura Carnelos is illuminated on this very subject. Detailed analytical work always sits at the foundation of sound assessments on a large scale. The liturgical use of a book of hours falls within the much wider issue of the spread of ecclesiastical and political influence of certain areas over others. Most notably, the continuous spread of the influence of Rome, and closer to us, that of Serum. Suffice here to say that these phenomena materialized and crystallized in books. The most evident place to notice this, and its often transitional nature, is in calendars. The handout presents the calendar of the Roman Curia circa 1260. This and later bibliographical reference you will be able to access easily when PowerPoints will be on the CERL website, so don't worry about scribbling. So the calendar you have here in the first column is what I use as benchmark every time I need to assess a calendar. You just need to add to it the canonical Franciscan and Dominican feasts, introduced slightly later. This is also what is stuck in my memory. The first time I visited the great liturgy historian Father Pierre-Marie G in his room at the Couvent Saint-Jacques in Paris, I remember giving him the transcription of a calendar of the Holy Sepulchre and him scanning it and just telling me the names which would require further analysis. I was so amazed, but in fact, with a little practice, it's very easy to spot the anomalies and to work on them. In the second column is the earliest calendar printed in Venice by Jensen in 1474. This is also, this I also have used as benchmark in my work that's circulating around on 15th century books of hours printed in Italy. Then I have included two typical French calendars. They represent the two flavors you can find in the vast French and specifically Parisian production. The first is in French and in martyrological form, that is, with an entry for every day of the year. Some scholars believe that this type of calendar cannot offer historical clues because it was, so to speak, standard. I disagree. A selection is still necessary among many options of saints' names celebrated on each day of the year. That selection is our clue. Finally, you have a standard Piguchet calendar for the use of Rome, but printed in Paris. There is much uniformity in French production, but local names do creep in when manuscript exemplars from different areas and traditions were used as printer's copy, obviously. And it is these variations which we want to catch. So the solution is always the same: systematic census, mapping, and collation. What is at stake? I've tried to show in my book that books of hours continue to be produced. However, the Vulgate on this genre states that it declined after the Reform. This is so ingrained that the first two reviewers of my book were not able to grasp my challenge to the current shared understanding of the phenomenon of the popularity of the hours. Namely, that hundreds of editions continued to be produced and used, certainly in Italy and in France and probably elsewhere. I can think at Antwerp, for example, well into the 18th century. I will briefly show the standard tool to identify the liturgical use and as stored at matins of certain offices. This reference, as I said, you will be able to find more extensively on the PowerPoint. For the office of the Triduum Sacrum, there is the work of Pierre-Marie G. For the office of the dead, the work of Knud Ottensen. For the office of the Virgin, the quickest reference is the work of Falconer Maiden and its expansion by Victor Leroquet and Gabriel Bessac. I believe the IRHT is finally going to do something with the liturgical data which they inherited from liturgical scholars. Let me now offer some examples where the analysis of the calendar has opened the way to not insignificant historical issues. I was able to map stemma don't worry, you don't need to read it. Just see the shape. A stemma editionum of the 74 editions of Books of Hours printed in Italy, combining the evidence coming from their textual content and its arrangement, and from their calendars. So, first case, the edition printed by Jenson in 1475. Jenson printed 4 editions between 1474 and 75. The calendar of the first one is the one listed here, peculiar enough to allow me to establish direct descent of other calendars and editions from it. The calendar of its last edition is different in some important details. It closes, so this is one of the few copies surviving in Paris. It closes with a versified colophon by Raphael Zovenzoni, an Istrian humanist active in Venice in the printing shops of Vindelino de Spira and Jenson, and also a member of their same confraternity, the Confraternity of San Girolamo. Moreover, in the month of May, looks normal, no? It contains an entry for Domnus, 7th of May. Who was Domnus? He was Archbishop of Salona, today Split, in Croatia. And in the month of November, we have Giusti, 2nd of November. Who was he? Bishop of Trieste, also venerated as in the Patriarchal Church of San Pietro di Castello in Venice. There are also more Franciscan connotations, translation of the body of St. Francis, his stigmata, translation of the body of St. Clare, and of St. Louis. One of the largest book investments I ever made in my life was the purchase of the entire Bibliotheca Sanctorum, a very useful tool, which is worth locating in the libraries you work on. Back to the Book of Hours. The evidence of those saints suggests that Zovenzoni was not just a corrector, but the link between Jenson and the observant Franciscans. Zovenzoni acted as editor and author of works which promoted the cult of the Little Simon of Trent, a cult strongly supported by Bernardino da Feltre and his observant Franciscans, as well as by Johannes Hinderbach, the Bishop of Trent, and a close relation to Zovenzoni. It is under the bishop's influence that the Emperor Friedrich III crowned Zovenzoni a poet laureate in Trent. It is no chance that in the same year, 1475, Jenson reprinted a work by Johannes Maria Tuberinus, not that common. He was a Brescia physician involved in the Little Simon case, whose book, the Relatio de Simone Puero Tridentino, became one of the instruments of an anti-Semitic campaign which was as horrific as it was effective. This to say that this evidence can clear, at least in part, or show the better context for past accusations of anti-Semitism addressed to Jenson. Moreover, the early provenance of the 2 extant copies of Jenson's previous editions, no, I go to the second case. There was more evidence for the connection with the Franciscans. Case number 2, still related. This 1475 edition happens to have been used by the famous scribe Bartolomeo Sanvito in the preparation of most of his wonderful manuscript books of hours. This discovery carried, of course, substantial implications on the dating of these manuscripts. But is not only other evidence that we can find in some of these manuscripts, like the one in Biblioteca Comunale of the Archiginnasio, studied by Daniele Guernelli, is that not only the saints are present, but there are spelling mistakes that are exactly matching the spelling mistakes in the 75 Jenson calendar. In fact, it seems that in some of these cases, if it's San Vito, he tried to do some correcting, emendation, because he chooses, for example, he corrects Justi in Justini, a more common saint in calendars. And again, Domnus in Donnini, a much more standard saint. And Giorgi Gorgoni. So he actually tried, he actively worked on some of these entries. Another example of manuscript prepared using the 75 editions by Jenson for exemplar is the Ghislieri Hour on the left, done by Pier Antonio Sallando, scribe active in Bologna, and again in the Offiziolo Durazzo, that also written by Sallando, was based not on this edition, but on other Venetian calendars, printed Venetian calendars. Over the years, since the publication of my first article on calendars, books of hours, printed in Italy, I have exchanged information with a number of scholars working on manuscript books of hours of the same period, and was able to verify a number of cases when printed editions were clearly used as exemplars for the production of manuscripts. What has been gathered so far, though, is unsystematic. With the publication of my book, I expect more cases to come to light, as scholars will be able to use the data gathered in the book in a comparative way. You will see that at the end, all the calendars are transcribed in full. Let's now look at illustration. While you probably know that the life of Christ and the Virgin are generally the cycles more studied in books of hours, I found that there is instead substantial variation in the iconography of the Office of the Dead. In this first set of images, these are all Venetian or Neapolitan editions, where the iconography, death and the dignitaries, so the three dead and the three alives, or the burial service, or the last day of judgment, are foreign importations, not Italian iconography to do with the Office of the Dead. What is the Italian style? Generally is the last unction, often of a figure in Venetian books of hours that seem to be a female, sometimes in a more religious environment that can suggest a community, sometimes just a house. What you find here in the final one is a combination, though, of the iconography, which is typically Italian Venetian, the lady at the last extreme unction, but surrounded, as you can well see, and the style of the woodcut is Italian and Venetian, but the borders are totally French. So this is something that gives you an indication of the enormous influence that French books of hours, though started printing 10 years later than the one in Italy, exert on the Italian iconography and the Italian style of decoration for the woodcuts. So what I'm trying to conclude here, well, after the Council of Trent, let's say, most books of hours changed beyond recognition. They became a catechetical manual generally printed on poor quality paper with a few plain pictures. Their appearance seems to indicate that the target market by then was children. But were all editions of books of hours really like that? Were they still also used as the habitual preferred reading of the ordinary religious and lay people? Different types of editions with a different appearance continued to be printed. Scholars really should avoid imposing on the past boundaries represented by their own knowledge. Books of hours continued to be produced and used in large quantities well into the final decades of the 16th century, as well as, it would seem, into the 17th and 18th centuries. The evidence from the Plantine archives, bookseller stocks inventories, and the Venetian archives will be of crucial guidance in mapping this history. At some point in the 16th century, in conjunction with the appropriation of the genre by the Jesuits and other religious teaching institutions, some books of hours changed their appearance, but others did not. It is likely that even in a counter-Reformation climate, attractive editions for a general public and more austere ones under the Jesuit regulation continued to appear in parallel. It is the coexistence and tension between the two registers of these books that during the following centuries that a proper investigation should capture. It is slightly surprising that books of hours are not even mentioned among the types of devotional books favored in the modern period. I cannot help thinking that in addition to the undoubtedly reduced influence of books of hours at the end of the 16th century, the other reason they are not discussed is, quite simply, the lack of a substantial work on books of hours in the 16th century, probably a consequence of the lack of bibliographical analysis of this type of book for that period. It is otherwise hard to explain how hundreds of editions of one single type of book could be ignored by historians of the modern period. As I've tried to show in my book, books of hours have a very long history and can be found in various flavors, at first survived in high numbers and then subject to increasing rates of loss. These contrasting elements set substantial challenges to the historians who undertake to study and understand them. But without the will to expand horizons and move outside their comfort zone, such historians risk offering their readers a narrative that does not correspond to the reality, which can be, with some more effort and with combined methodological approaches, captured. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Cristina. I think we've got a few minutes for a question or two, if there are questions. I suppose I had a question, which is in your longer work on this, you combine this sort of textual analysis and looking at calendars and so on with an analysis of where the books of hours are now and where they've been and how far they survive. And I wondered whether you'd like to comment on the extent to which the two types of evidence help to modify one another.
Absolutely. I should say that many of these books of ours, all we knew about was one short line in an old bibliography, in many cases. And so it's been quite an exercise to approach and trying to fill the gap of their life from what we have today, the book itself, and all the clues that we can get from the book, and also using very successfully historical bibliography. One of the tools I found most useful has been those kind of publications of the 18th century, like Giustiniani for Venice, or not Venice, Giustiniani for Naples, and similar sort of things, where the scholar who writes about an edition says, I've seen a copy of this edition in the house of Mr. Del Maino in Naples. And there we got some major clues, because we know that one edition was in Naples in 1728 or something. That is information that we totally didn't have, because did not leave any mark whatsoever on the physicality of the book. So documents, archives, and historical bibliography have been absolutely vital for filling the gaps. Then it's amazing what you can find when you start looking. Yeah.
Sorry, can I? Ooh. What part does the distinction between the use of religious orders, diocesan use, and broader regional criteria play in the analysis of these calendars?
Noticeable, because with the exception of probably 2 editions, and then here I'm talking about the Italian editions, they're all use of Rome. So that's a bit generic. Well, the use of Rome by the 14th and 15th century has expanded to all of Italy and beyond Italy. So you need to specify what it means, use of Rome. And what the calendars of the printed editions have done has been spreading everywhere in the country and beyond a very specific calendar from a very specific diocese, often from a very specific church, from which they got their manuscript exemplar. And so, because of the occasionality of the manuscript exemplar used by certain printers, and because most of the printers were Venetians, we're talking about Venetian editions, they spread then everywhere in Italy where these books were used, and sometimes also outside Italy early on, the Venetian use of the Roman type. And this is fascinating. I mean, it's totally entangled. And I'm pretty sure that the same thing applies for, why do you say no? Applies for France as well. Not in the same extent, but in a smaller quantity, yes. Is it clear that, okay. So, sorry?
It's not clear, I think, or it won't be clear to everybody, because we talk about the Roman, we say this is a Roman missal.
Yeah.
We say the Franciscans follow the Roman use.
Yeah.
And that's a different statement from saying this is the diocese of Rouen.
Sure, but that is the easy thing. Liturgically, all of Europe was divided in dioceses, and many of them had their own use. Then from the from the 13th century on, Rome, that at a certain point was probably only used in the area of Rome and in Avignon, gets expanded. And so Rome becomes a super use, like Serum becomes a super use. And so if you have a missal, and at the heading it says use of Rome, it tells you very little. It tells you that you have to look further, and not in the liturgy, because the liturgy will show probably more correctly the use of Rome, but the calendars instead will tell you which flavor of the use of Rome, because the calendars are not as canonized as a set of responsories in an office. The calendars fluctuates, and it shows much better the transitional situation between the application or wanting to apply a standard use, in many cases Rome, and apply instead a local, inevitably the local flavor of that use. Because in manuscripts, like in printed books, you depend on physical exemplar. And be sure that the Roman Missal used in San Mark does not contain only the same saints of the Roman Missal used in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. They will have the same responsories, and inevitably they will have the saints they venerated in the individual places. And that is great for us because it allows us to trace a bit more beyond just the use, when the use is so generic. Is that clearer?
Thank you very
Sure.
much, Cristina.
Oh,
Thank you very much indeed.
I was just wondering, talking about this peculiar use of calendars, etc. Have you found instances of books of hours that travel from the place of production, where they should have had the calendar, the place, travel in another town in Italy, and where
What do
the
they do?
readers would have in fact
change,
corrected.
yeah. That's the big question. Taking into fact that with printing, we have a dissemination of a use of a specific place throughout Italy, let's say Venice, peculiar saints everywhere in Italy, what these people who used the books thought, you wonder. Luckily, I found the solution also reading the work of a scholar who worked on martyrologies, which apparently have the same situation. And basically, he thinks that they kind of took it in their stride, but then it's also the case that you find additions of what they particularly care added to them. In the printed editions, not as much modification as additions as I would have expected, actually. While you see it often in a manuscript, that a manuscript from Milan gets used in Bologna, sure enough, they cross out and add their own. In the printed, a bit less so. But it was interesting how, of course, other scholars who were faced with this mess, I mean, beautiful mess for us to study, but it's a mess of the liturgical shake and move and calendars, you know, how did people react to it? I think we need to know, we need to see many more books and check their marginal annotations to get a proper answer.
Another thing is, speaking of San Vito, the thing is that he used different editions in different manuscripts of Book of Hours that he copied.
Some different.
Some of
Yeah.
this, yes. But, you know, the one that recently came out, it was definitely not Franciscan.
But this one that I show you has been used in at least 10 manuscripts. As we,
But
you know,
I mean, it means that to him, in a sense, it didn't have a particular importance.
I think absolutely. He was just an exemplar, and maybe then I got a better one. Yeah.
This will have to be our last question.
Sorry, just a question on the a copy I saw in your book. The one used in Vero of L'Aquila, there's a number of saints added, but there's also one who has been scraped out. Why, but not replaced, apparently, just scraped out. Why, do you have any idea why this would happen?
If the scraping happens after Reformation and the likes, outside Italy, you think of the obvious, some sort of dictamen from the high levels. Otherwise, no, I don't know. Either something that was going on that we don't know about, or further investigation maybe would give an answer.
And presumably with some of these movements of books from the place that they came from to somewhere else, they're actually taken by somebody who originally has them in one place and goes to the other. And that may result in rather different types of annotation
Absolutely.
from the type of annotation you'll get if they're being, for whatever reason, perhaps for a commercial reason or something else, imported into that place.
Absolutely, and again, evidence from the books that survived is vital. May I just say that what I've said of this messy situation about books of hours can also be found in breviaries and missals. All the work still there needs to be done. But sure enough, the first edition of the so-called Roman Missal, it was a Milanese calendar. Totally obvious, because the exemplar came from Milan. And the first example of the perfect Roman breviary by Jensen is full of Venetian saints. So that is the beauty and the complexity of the calendar part of these editions. But they will allow us to work on these, like in philology, you use mistakes to trace the dissemination of one edition from the other. But it's all work that still needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Cristina.
Pleasure.
Thank you.